People tend to ignore the janitor, not because they're cruel, because after seeing the same person pushing the same mop every morning for years, they stop noticing him altogether. That was my life for almost 3 decades. My name is Michael Turner. I'm 58 years old, and for the last 27 years, I've worked as the janitor at Hawthorne Agricultural Equipment, one of the largest manufacturing plants in western Kansas. If you asked anyone in town who I was, they'd probably say something like, "Oh, that's Mike. Nice guy. Keeps the factory clean." And they'd be right. I cleaned offices before sunrise, swept the production floors after every shift, fixed broken light fixtures, changed air filters, made coffee when the machine broke, unclogged drains, replaced burned-out light bulbs. If something needed doing and nobody else wanted to do it, I usually handled it. Most people assumed I had always been a janitor. That assumption never bothered me. Sometimes it's easier when people underestimate you. They stop expecting things. They stop asking questions. They simply let you do your job. For 27 years, that's exactly what I wanted. Every morning I arrived before 5. The parking lot would still be empty, except for my old blue pickup truck. I'd unlock the maintenance entrance, turn on the hallway lights, start a fresh pot of coffee, and spend the next 2 hours making sure everything looked perfect before the first employees arrived. By 7 o'clock, the factory came alive. Forklifts buzzed through the warehouse. Massive robotic welders lit up the production floor with flashes of blue light. Steel presses echoed through the building. Hundreds of employees hurried to their stations. Almost nobody noticed that the trash cans were already empty. The floors were spotless. Every restroom had been cleaned. Every hallway smelled fresh. That's the thing about maintenance. When you do your job well, people barely realize you're there. The factory had become my second home. I knew every hallway, every storage room, every electrical panel, every strange sound each machine made when something wasn't quite right. Sometimes the maintenance technicians joked that I knew the building better than they did. They weren't entirely wrong. One Tuesday morning, while replacing ceiling lights near Assembly Line 4, a young engineer named Kevin climbed onto the ladder beside me. "Morning, Mike." "Morning." He looked exhausted. "Tough day?" "Tough month." He laughed quietly. "The new production software keeps throwing random shutdown errors. They'll figure it out." "I hope so." He glanced toward the giant robotic assembly line. "I swear this factory has a mind of its own." I smiled. "No, it just doesn't like being rushed." He laughed. "What does that even mean?" "Nothing." I climbed down from the ladder and wheeled my toolbox away. Some things are easier left unexplained, especially when people wouldn't believe you anyway. About 6 months earlier, everything at Hawthorne had changed. The company had been purchased by a massive manufacturing corporation based in Chicago. For years, Hawthorne had operated independently. We built reliable farm equipment. Nothing flashy, nothing revolutionary. Just machines farmers trusted because they rarely broke. The new owners promised bigger investments, modern technology, higher profits, more efficiency. At first, everyone welcomed the news. Then the executives started arriving. Expensive suits, luxury rental cars, consultants carrying tablets instead of toolboxes. People who spoke confidently about manufacturing without ever stepping onto the production floor. Their favorite words seemed to be optimization. "We're optimizing workflows. We're optimizing staffing. We're optimizing production costs." Nobody on the factory floor knew exactly what that meant. But every time they used the word, someone lost their job. The new CEO introduced himself during a company-wide meeting. His name was Richard Coleman, 42 years old, Harvard MBA, previously managed 3 different manufacturing companies. He walked confidently across the stage while colorful charts filled the giant projector screen behind him. "The future belongs to companies willing to evolve. We respect Hawthorne's history, but history doesn't build tomorrow." Everyone applauded politely. I noticed something interesting. He never once mentioned the people who had built Hawthorne into the company he had just purchased. Over the following months, Richard replaced nearly every department manager with executives from corporate headquarters. Many longtime supervisors accepted early retirement. Others quietly resigned. The factory felt different, colder somehow. The old culture slowly disappeared. Instead of asking mechanics how to improve production, executives hired outside consultants. Instead of listening to experienced welders, they studied spreadsheets. One afternoon, I overheard two consultants discussing the factory while standing outside the maintenance office. This place is full of unnecessary employees. We could automate half these jobs. The other man nodded. I was thinking the same thing. He looked directly toward me. What does the janitor even do all day? I smiled politely. Mostly cleaning. He laughed. At least you're honest. I didn't bother correcting him. A week later, another announcement echoed through the factory. Corporate planned to move a large portion of manufacturing to a brand new automated facility in Texas. The Kansas plant would gradually shut down over the next 18 months. The news hit the town like an earthquake. Nearly 1,200 people worked at Hawthorne. Thousands more depended on those jobs. Restaurants, gas stations, repair shops, local suppliers. If the factory closed, the entire town would suffer. People were scared. Some started looking for work elsewhere immediately. Others hoped the decision would somehow change. One evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the employee cafeteria drinking coffee. Linda, one of the cafeteria cooks, sat across from me. You've been awfully quiet lately. I've been thinking. You worried? A little. She sighed. My husband has worked here 32 years. If this place closes, I don't know what we'll do. Neither did I. But I knew something most people didn't. Closing this factory wouldn't be nearly as easy as corporate believed. The following month, engineers from headquarters began documenting every production line before transferring equipment to Texas. They scanned machines, photographed wiring, created digital models. Everything seemed to be progressing smoothly. Then, Assembly Line 3 unexpectedly shut down. Not for an hour, not for a day, for 4 straight days. Nobody understood why. Corporate flew in software specialists, electrical engineers, automation consultants. They replaced sensors, updated firmware, installed new controllers. Nothing worked. Each failed repair cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. By the 5th day, frustration spread through the entire building. Executives held emergency meetings. Consultants argued with engineers. Managers blamed maintenance. Maintenance blamed software. The production floor remained completely silent. Late that afternoon, I pushed my cleaning cart past the disabled assembly line. Several engineers stood around a control cabinet, staring at diagnostic screens filled with error codes. Kevin noticed me. He smiled tiredly. Wish you had a magic mop, Mike. I wish. One consultant looked at me and chuckled. Unless you've secretly got an engineering degree, I don't think there's much you can do. Several people laughed. I simply nodded and continued walking. About 20 feet later, I stopped. Something didn't sound right. Not the alarms, not the computers, the air. I slowly turned around. For nearly a minute, I stood perfectly still, listening. Then I walked back toward the control cabinet. Can I ask a strange question? The consultant raised an eyebrow. Sure. Did this problem start after you replaced the hydraulic pressure regulators on Monday? Every conversation stopped instantly. Kevin looked confused. Yeah. How did you know that? I looked toward the production line. Because Pump 7 has been making the wrong vibration pattern ever since. The consultant laughed. You can identify hydraulic failures. By listening? I shrugged. No, I can identify that hydraulic failure. The laughter disappeared. For the first time all week, every engineer in the room was looking directly at the janitor. For a long moment, nobody said a word. The consultant folded his arms and smiled. So, the janitor thinks he knows what's wrong. There was enough sarcasm in his voice for everyone to hear. I didn't react. Kevin looked between us. Mike, what do you mean by the vibration pattern? I walked toward the massive hydraulic unit sitting beside the production line. The pump itself sounded normal. The pressure gauges looked normal. Even the temperature readings were exactly where they should have been. But something wasn't right. I gently placed my hand against one of the steel pipes. There, one of the engineers frowned. What? The pressure pulse. He looked confused. I don't feel anything. I know. You've never felt what it's supposed to feel like. The consultant laughed again. This is ridiculous. Richard Coleman had arrived only minutes earlier after being pulled out of another emergency meeting. He glanced around impatiently. Has anyone found the problem yet? The consultant pointed directly at me. Our janitor believes he has. Richard looked at me for a second before sighing. At this point, let him finish. I slowly walked around the machinery. Most people were staring at the computers. I wasn't. Machines rarely lie. People do. The line had operated almost flawlessly for more than 25 years. A system doesn't suddenly become unreliable without a reason. I stopped beside a large steel cabinet hidden behind the conveyor. Who authorized replacing this regulator? One of the engineers raised his hand. It came from corporate. The old unit was considered obsolete. I know. I knelt beside the cabinet. The replacement looked identical. Same manufacturer, same dimensions, same specifications. Almost. I pointed toward a tiny serial plate. This valve responds 12 milliseconds faster. Kevin leaned closer. 12 milliseconds? That's nothing. It is. Unless every other hydraulic component was designed around the original timing. Several engineers looked confused. I continued, the software isn't failing. The sensors aren't failing. The new valve is opening too early. That tiny difference creates pressure oscillations. The safety system interprets them as a hydraulic fault. Silence. One consultant shook his head. That's impossible. I looked at him calmly. No, it's engineering. Richard frowned. Can anyone verify what he's saying? Kevin immediately pulled the original technical drawings onto his laptop. Several engineers crowded around him. The room became completely silent except for keyboards clicking. About 2 minutes later, Kevin slowly looked up. His face had gone pale. Oh, my God. Richard stepped forward. What? Kevin turned the screen around. The original hydraulic timing sequence matches exactly what Mike just described. The consultant stared at the drawings. That can't be right. Kevin zoomed in. The replacement valve really is faster. It changes the entire pressure cycle. One engineer whispered, we've been looking at software when the problem has been mechanical all along. Richard looked back at me. How could you possibly know that? I smiled slightly. Because I remembered designing it. Nobody moved. I don't understand. You designed... From what exactly? I looked across the production floor. This entire hydraulic synchronization system. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Richard frowned. You were a janitor. I am a janitor. I wasn't always. Kevin stared at me. Wait, you actually worked on this production line? I nodded. Before any of you were hired. Richard looked genuinely confused. Nobody mentioned that. They probably forgot. The oldest maintenance supervisor in the building suddenly walked into the group. His name was Frank. He had worked at Hawthorne for 39 years. He looked at me, then at Richard. You really don't know who he is? Richard shook his head. Frank couldn't help smiling. When this factory opened, Mike wasn't pushing a mop. He was the lead systems engineer. Every eye turned toward me. Frank continued. He designed most of the hydraulic coordination system. He wrote the original maintenance manuals. He trained the first engineering team. He practically lived here during construction. The consultant looked stunned. But why would someone go from lead engineer to janitor? I hesitated for a second, then answered honestly. My wife got sick. Very sick. The room remained silent. She was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. I had a 6-year-old daughter. The engineering position required traveling almost every week. I couldn't do both. So I stepped down. The company let me move into maintenance. I worked close to home. I picked my daughter up from school every afternoon. I spent every evening with my wife until she passed away. Nobody interrupted. I never regretted that decision. Frank quietly added, most people retired. Mike simply stayed. Richard slowly sat down on a nearby toolbox. For the first time since arriving, he looked completely speechless. The consultant cleared his throat. So, if you're right, how do we fix it? I smiled. Put the original regulator back. 3 mechanics immediately removed the replacement valve. Luckily, no one had thrown the old component away. 20 minutes later, the original unit was back in place. Kevin looked toward Richard. Ready? Richard nodded. Start the line. Everyone held their breath. The motors started. Hydraulic pressure increased. The robotic welders activated one by one. Conveyor belts began moving. Steel frames rolled smoothly through every workstation. No alarms. No shutdowns. No error messages. The entire production line ran perfectly. For the first time in almost a week, the factory was operating again. Nobody cheered. They simply stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Richard slowly walked over. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I think I do. He looked around the building. I spent 6 months believing I understood this factory. You understood the financial reports. You never understood the people. That sentence hit harder than I intended. Richard nodded. I think you're right. Over the following days, something remarkable happened. Instead of preparing to shut the Kansas plant down, corporate postponed every relocation meeting. Engineers started interviewing longtime employees before making decisions. Mechanics were invited into planning sessions. Maintenance workers were asked for ideas. People who had spent decades inside the factory finally had a voice again. A month later, Richard asked me to join him in the boardroom. I'd like to offer you a position. I'm listening. Director of Manufacturing Systems. You'd lead the modernization project. You'd train our younger engineers. You'd help redesign every future production line. The salary was nearly 4 times what I earned as a janitor. I looked at the contract for a long moment, then smiled. I'll accept, but only if one condition is included. Richard raised an eyebrow. What condition? No executive makes changes to a production line, but without first talking to the people who actually work on it. He laughed. I think that's a condition we should have had years ago. Today, Hawthorne employs more people than ever before. The factory was never moved to Texas. Instead, it became the company's primary research and manufacturing center. Kevin now leads one of the engineering teams. Frank finally retired after 42 years. Richard still jokes that the most expensive consultant the company ever hired was the janitor they already had. People often ask whether I regret spending 27 years pushing a mop. Not even for a second, because every hallway I cleaned, every machine I quietly listened to, every conversation with mechanics, welders, and technicians taught me something no textbook ever could. Never judge someone's value by the title on their name badge. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one holding the knowledge that keeps the entire place standing.